Hello everyone. Today I want to show a game played in 2008 in the World Championship between Viswanathan Anand and Vladimir Kramnik. Uh, I really like this game. It really shows how important it is to calculate till the right point, and it's very hard to know, almost impossible to know the right point because we have to stop our calculations at some point or the other, and we have to evaluate the position correctly. But sometimes it's that one move further that makes all the difference, and you'll see what I mean. Let's check out the game. So, Kramnik had the white pieces. He starts with d4 and d5, c4 and c6. We have the queen's gambit declined, the semi-Slav, knight f3 and knight f6, knight c3 and e6, e3, knight bd7 and bishop d3. Now, once the bishop has developed, it's common to wait till the light square bishop is moved before we capture on c4. So the bishop has to waste a tempo, and bishop into c4 and b5, pushing the bishop back to d3 and a6. We have e4 and c5, gaining some central influence, and e5, hitting the knight. C takes d4, counter-attacking, and knight takes b5, grabbing a pawn. Now there are a couple of moves here. So knight g4 is an idea. Knight into e5 is a very commonly played move over here. So we can see the line. So knight into e5, which leads to knight into e5, a into b5, and bishop into b5, and bishop d7. So a lot of exchanges are going to happen. Knight into d7 and queen a5 check to pick up the bishop. So I have bishop d2 and queen into b5, and there's an option of knight into f8 is possible. Knight into f6 is also possible, just because the knight was otherwise trapped. Rook into f8 and perhaps let's say a4, hitting the queen. So this is one variation. But after knight into b5, Anand chose a into b5 immediately, giving up the f6 knight. And that's what Kramnik does. He grabs the knight on f6 and g into f6. Castles and queen b6, just defending the d4 pawn. And this will be very important later on. The d4 pawn becomes the star of the show later on, and we'll see what I mean. Queen e2, going after the b5 pawn. Not Kramnik is not worried about the d4 pawn just yet, and bishop b7. This position has occurred before, but through a different move order. And in a way, it's a novelty in some sense. Bishop into b5 and rook g8. This certainly is a novelty instead of some known moves such as bishop d6. Anand goes to pressure the semi-open g file, right where white's king is, and the bishop is on the long diagonal of h1 to a8. If the knight should move, there could be some problems, and bishop f4 just developing. Bishop d6 now, challenging the bishop there, and bishop to g3, thinking, well, of course, in this position, if the bishops are exchanged, after h into g3, white is very happy with that secure king. The g file is closed. The rook on g8 will do nothing here, and black will have to worry about king safety. So after bishop g3, the point is to dislodge that strong bishop, strong defensive piece actually in front of the king. So f5, f4 is threatened, and it's very interesting here. Kramnik played rook fc1, and this is very important because it's on the open file. Rook fd1, a very small difference, but in practical terms it would be a huge difference, because while this does threaten the d4 pawn, after f4 and bishop h4, it would allow rook a5 to pressure the bishop, and let's say a4, you can even give up the rook. And after a into b5 and knight e5, which puts too much pressure on f3, it forces knight into e5. We have rook into g2 first. And after king f1, you have rook into h2, threatening rook h1 checkmate. So knight f3 is forced, but we can grab it. First rook h1 check, forcing uh, uh, either king g2, or which would allow rook into h4. But first, if king g2, the knight is pinned, so knight no longer defends the bishop, and we can grab the piece back. And this would be quite good for black. Now black would be slightly better. So rook fc1 is quite important. And it's important to know that here, after f4 and bishop h4, the same idea does not work, because there is an important difference. Because if now rook a5 is tried, and a4, rook into b5 and a into b5, and knight e5 as in the similar previous line, and after rook into h2 g2 and king f1, and we have rook into h2, there is this idea of rook a8 check, deflecting the bishop, and the bishop will no longer control the c8 square, and you have rook c8. So the rook on d1 versus rook on c1 is a huge difference, and the king really has no squares. And we see the knight covers d7, and the bishop takes away e7, and d8 squares, the rook is covering f8, so you have to give up the queen and get checkmated. So after bishop h4 was played here, there's no rook if Anand did not go for the losing line. He played bishop e7 simply, offering a trade of bishops, and if the king were to land on e7, it would be quite secure there. a4, cementing that bishop into h4, and knight into h4. But the knight now is on the rim, and we say the knight on the rim is grim, or knight on the rim is dim. But it has to keep an eye on the g2 square. It has to be defended, because otherwise that would be very bad for the white king. And king e7 simply, keeping the pressure intact. The rooks are connected. The king is quite secure. The Indian gave a very interesting and very inhuman idea of playing g3. I doubt any human would consider such a move, because it really weakens the light squares in front of the white king, and there is already a fianchettoed bishop on b7. But what it does do is allows the knight on h4 to move somewhere else and be a little more active, and it also blunts the bishop, the rook on g8. But I doubt a human would play like this. It just seems unnatural. Rook a3 was played instead, and rook a c8, challenging the white's rook on the open file. Rook d1 now would be a little better, just avoiding a trade, but Kramnik chose to trade, and rook c8. So some easing of the pressure from on g2, rook a1 going back, and queen c5. The queen wants to come to a more central square, queen g4, and queen a5, just keeping it near the king, just in case some defense is needed. And also e5 is a very good central square. Knight f3, hitting the queen, and queen f6, allowing for the knight to come to e5 and put some pressure on f3. And rook to e1, gaining some control over e5. Rook c5, gaining control over e5. So there's a battle for e5 going on. And b4, dislodging the rook, which goes to c3. And there is pressure on f3 already. The bishop could capture, and then the knight could land on e5. Over here, a reasonable line would be bishop into d7. Just take away the knight, so you don't have to worry about knight e5, and king into d7. Let's say knight d2, getting out of the way, and queen g6. Black is slightly better, but it's okay. This is playable. However, at this point, this really the important part of the game begins. Kramnik thought of a way to grab the d4 pawn, and it almost works, but just doesn't. So he goes for knight into d4, and this is where calculating one move ahead makes all the difference. So it's queen into d4, and the idea is after rook d1, you will capture the d7 knight. A simple enough plan. However, you have knight f6 first, hitting the queen. So there's a swap of queens, rook into d4 and knight into g4. But the bishop in b7 is vulnerable now. Rook d7 check. Anyway, king f6 and rook into b7. And while the back rank is weak, it's probable that Kramnik saw that bishop f1 saves the day, and he has two connected passed pawns on the queen side, and this should be winning for white. But I'll ask you to pause the video here, and can you find the only winning move for Anand? Try to win the World Championship game. It's the stunning knight e3. Puts a double attack on the bishop. So let's for a moment examine if you try to run away. You are simply just losing a piece and some pawns, and you lose the game. What happens with the obvious f into e3? You have that f4 pawn very handily capturing on e3, and here Kramnik resigned because there is no decent defense to e2, which would pick up the bishop and bring a queen. So after f into e3, the defense could be rook c7. Just get rid of the rook from c1 and you lose a rook. And you play g3 to get out of the thing, rook c1 and king g2. But rook c2 is coming anyway. And you will push, you will try to push a piece. And if the king goes anywhere except f3, then you are supported, then e2 comes anyway. And well, this allows for rook f2. Not that you need too much help winning with the rook up. And that's why I really admire this game, that even at the highest levels, something as simple, if I can use the word simple, as calculation can decide the course of a game. But yes, calculating 10 to 12 moves down the line is not at all easy. But Anand found the wonderful move and he allowed Kramnik to falter. So, well, that's the game. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.